Boring History for Sleep, How Medieval Rich Kids Learn Stuff. Welcome to a boring journey through history. Tonight, we gently embark on an extended exploration of noble education in medieval France, somewhere around the year 1220. For the next 2 hours, we'll slowly and thoroughly drift through the boring world of feudal nobility, examining each detail of how young aristocrats were raised, trained, and prepared for their roles in medieval society. We'll explore their childhood education, their martial training, their understanding of literature and history, and the complex social systems that shaped their lives. Allow the steady stream of information to carry you towards sleep as we delve deep into this distant yet fascinating world. Picture, if you will, the rolling hills of medieval France, dotted with imposing stone castles that rise from the landscape like ancient sentinels. These fortresses, with their thick walls and narrow windows, serve as both homes and strongholds for the noble families who rule over the surrounding lands. Within these castle walls, young nobles are being shaped and molded according to traditions that have evolved over centuries, traditions that will determine not just their personal futures, but the fate of entire regions. The education of a feudal nobleman was a comprehensive process that began in early childhood and extended well into young adulthood. Unlike modern education systems that focus primarily on academic knowledge, the training of medieval nobles encompassed every aspect of life: physical prowess, social graces, military skills, religious devotion, and the complex codes of honor that governed aristocratic society. This education was not merely about acquiring knowledge, it was about becoming a complete member of the ruling class, capable of governing lands, leading armies, and maintaining the intricate web of feudal relationships that held medieval society together. Chapter 1: The Warrior Culture of Medieval Nobility. To truly understand the education of feudal nobles, we must first immerse ourselves in the cultural context that shaped their worldview. The medieval nobility of France lived in a society where warfare was not merely common, but celebrated as the highest expression of aristocratic virtue. This warrior culture permeated every aspect of noble life, from the songs they sang to the values they instilled in their children. Consider a nobleman named Bertrand de Born, a troubadour and companion of the famous Richard the Lion-Hearted. This gentleman poet composed verses that echoed through castle halls across France, expressing sentiments that modern listeners might find startling. His little song proclaimed, "Peace delights me not. War, be thou my lot. Law, I do not know, save a right good blow." These words, which might seem shocking to our modern sensibilities, represented the deeply ingrained values of an entire social class. The nobility's enthusiasm for warfare went far beyond mere acceptance of conflict as a necessity. Even those lords who nodded piously when monks and priests praised the virtues of peace harbored secret wishes in their hearts that it were not sinful to pray for vigorous combat. The ambition of nearly every noble worthy of his birth was to become an accomplished warrior, capable of both delivering and receiving powerful blows in battle, to savor the intoxicating joy of victory over formidable opponents, and ultimately to die what they considered a warrior's death on the field of honor, rather than what they dismissively called a cow's death in one's bed. Bertrand de Born expressed this brutal joy in combat with even greater detail in another of his compositions. He wrote of prizing no food or drink compared to the cry of "on, on," from throats straining with battle fury, the neighing of frightened horses running wild, the forest ringing with the sounds of combat, the calls for help from fallen warriors, and the sight of bodies beyond aid, still pierced with broken weapons. To modern readers, accustomed to viewing war through the lens of tragedy and loss, these sentiments reveal a profoundly different worldview, one where combat was not merely accepted, but actively celebrated as the highest form of human endeavor. To understand why medieval nobles held such views, we must consider the practical realities of their daily lives. Even in France, which enjoyed a relatively temperate climate compared to northern Europe, the winters were long and cold. Days were short, nights seemingly endless, and castles, despite their imposing appearance, were fundamentally chilly, damp, and uncomfortable places to live. These stone fortresses, built for defense rather than comfort, housed many people in relatively small spaces, leading to constant friction and irritation among the inhabitants. The physical discomfort of castle life was compounded by the limited entertainment options available to the nobility. During the long winter months, when outdoor activities were restricted by weather, boredom became a constant companion. Even in summer, when hunting expeditions, hawking parties, minstrel performances, and tournaments provided diversion, these pleasures could grow stale with repetition. Many a baron, driven to irritability by sheer ennui, would become capricious and tyrannical toward those around him. In this context, warfare offered not just excitement and the possibility of glory, but a genuine escape from the monotony of daily life. The physical evidence of this warrior culture was visible on the very faces of the nobility. The older warriors around any given castle bore impressive collections of scars, deep marks on cheeks, chins and foreheads, mutilated noses and ears that told silent stories of fierce combat survived. Far from being sources of shame or regret, these disfigurements were worn as badges of honor, visible proofs of courage and martial prowess that commanded respect from peers and subordinates alike. Chapter 2. The Early Years, Childhood, in a Noble Household. Imagine, if you will, a young nobleman named Amory, who at the age of 19 stands on the threshold of knighthood. His story, typical of nobles of his generation, began many years earlier in the castle of Saint Aliquis, where his older brother Conan ruled as lord. From his earliest memories, Amory was immersed in a world where success in arms was held before him as the ultimate goal, the one achievement truly worth pursuing in life. The education of noble children began almost from the moment they could walk and talk. By the age of 7 or 8, young Amory was already learning to fence with a blunted sword, his small hands struggling to grip the leather-wrapped handle as he practiced basic defensive positions and offensive strike. These early lessons, conducted under the watchful eye of experienced warriors, laid the foundation for skills that would literally determine life or death in his adult years. From the age of 10 onward, his training became more systematic and intense. Sire Eustace, a grizzled veteran bearing his own collection of honorable scars, served as his primary instructor in the arts of combat. Later, recognizing the importance of expert instruction, Conan hired a professional fencing master, a skilled Gascon whose southern temperament and innovative techniques brought new dimensions to Amory's education. Day after day, in the castle's training yard, the young noble would practice his footwork, his blade work, and the crucial ability to maintain balance and composure, even when pressed by an aggressive opponent. But martial training was only one aspect of a noble child's education. Equally important was the development of skills related to the aristocratic lifestyle. Young Amory received his first horse at an early age, along with his own hawks and hunting dogs. He was taught not merely to ride and hunt with these animals, but to care for them personally, understanding their needs, their temperaments, and the intricate details of their maintenance. This hands-on approach to animal husbandry served multiple purposes. It developed practical skills, fostered a deep connection between the young noble and his animals, and instilled the principle that a true nobleman took personal responsibility for the creatures under his care. The forest surrounding St. Aliquis became Amory's extended classroom. From an early age, he was allowed, even encouraged, to undertake long solitary rides into the dense woodlands. These expeditions, which might seem dangerously permissive by modern standards, were carefully calculated to develop essential skills. In the trackless forest, where paths could disappear under fallen leaves and landmarks might be obscured by mist, the young noble learned to navigate by sun and stars, to read the subtle signs of animal passage, to find water and shelter, and most importantly, to remain calm and resourceful when faced with unexpected challenges. As Amory grew taller and stronger, his education expanded to include formal instruction in the social and moral codes that govern noble behavior. Conan, fulfilling his duty as both lord and elder brother, would deliver lengthy lectures on proper conduct, much as his wife, Adela, instructed their young ward, Aliénor, in the feminine arts. These lectures, drawing on generations of accumulated wisdom, covered every aspect of aristocratic life, from the profound to the mundane. Chapter 3: Moral and Practical Education. The moral education of young nobles followed patterns established over centuries, passed down from father to son, from lord to vassal, in an unbroken chain of tradition. Picture a scene in the great hall of St. Aliquis, where Conan sits with his younger brother, sharing the wisdom that will guide Amory through the complexities of noble life. These sessions, conducted with all the solemnity befitting their importance, covered both practical advice and deeper philosophical principles. "Listen well, fair brother," Conan would begin, his voice carrying the weight of authority and experience. "There are truths you must understand if you are to navigate this world successfully. First and foremost, you must learn to ask questions of good men, whom you know well, those whose judgment has been proven through years of honorable conduct. But never, and I cannot stress this enough, never put your complete trust in a stranger, no matter how fair his words or noble his appearance. The world is full of those who would take advantage of youthful inexperience." The religious duties of a nobleman formed a crucial part of this instruction. "Every day, without fail, you must hear the Holy Mass," Conan would continue. "This is not merely a matter of piety, though piety is important. Your presence at Mass demonstrates to all who observe you that you acknowledge a power greater than yourself, that you submit to divine authority, even as you exercise earthly power over others. Furthermore, whenever you have money in your purse, give generously to the poor. This is not merely charity, it is an investment in your spiritual welfare, for God will repay such generosity double in this life or the next." The concept of liberality, of open-handed generosity, was emphasized repeatedly in these lectures. "A cavalier who is sparing with his wealth," Conan would explain, "will lose everything in the end and die in wretchedness. Generosity is the mark of true nobility. Give freely, but wisely. When you give, do so without promising to give again, for repeated obligations can become burdensome chains that restrict your freedom of action." Even seemingly trivial matters received attention in these comprehensive instructions. When you come to a strange house, Conan advised, always cough very loudly before entering any room. This simple precaution may save you from witnessing something you ought not to see, preserving both your innocence and the privacy of others. Such small courtesies oil the wheels of social interaction and prevent unnecessary embarrassments. The education extended to leisure activities as well. When you find yourself in noble company, learn to play backgammon skillfully. You will be more highly prized on that account, for the game requires both strategic thinking and the ability to accept the vagaries of fortune with good grace. These same skills will serve you well in the greater games of politics and warfare. Behavioral standards within religious settings received particular emphasis. Never make noise or jest in church, Conan would warn sternly. Such behavior is the mark of unbelievers and will bring shame upon your family name. The church is a place of reverence where even the mightiest lord must bow his head in humility. Your conduct there reflects not just on yourself, but on all who share your blood. The advice extended to practical wisdom about avoiding unnecessary troubles. If you would shun conflict and complication in your life, avoid meddling in the affairs of others. Never pretend to knowledge you do not possess, for such pretense will inevitably be exposed, bringing humiliation upon you. Better to admit ignorance and learn than to feign understanding and be revealed as a fool. Social hierarchies and the proper treatment of inferiors formed another crucial area of instruction. Do not treat your body servant as your equal, Conan would explain, his tone serious. Do not let him sit by you at table or take him to bed with you as you might a brother or close companion. This may seem harsh, but remember, the more honor you show to a villain, the more he will despise you. The social order depends upon each knowing and keeping to their proper place. Kindness to inferiors is appropriate and even necessary, but familiarity breeds contempt. Perhaps most revealing of the medieval noble mindset was Conan's advice about marriage and the treatment of wives. After you are married, he would say with a knowing look, by no means tell a secret to your wife. Women, even the most trustworthy, cannot resist the temptation to gossip. If you confide in her, you will repent your act the first time you vex her, for in her anger, she will surely reveal what you have told her in confidence. This cynical view of marital relations, while jarring to modern sensibilities, reflected widespread attitudes among the medieval nobility. Chapter 4. The Literary Education of Young Nobles. Consider for a moment young Amory again, now comfortably seated in a dimly lit chamber within the monastery school near his family's castle. Here, Amory's education takes on a quieter yet equally crucial dimension: his literary training. Although primarily destined for battlefields and courtly halls rather than cloistered libraries, a nobleman's ability to read and understand written texts held considerable practical value. Many noblemen, even those who commanded large territories, could barely decipher the scrolls and charters prepared by their clerks. This reliance could easily place them at the mercy of those more literate, often monks and clerics, who might, intentionally or unintentionally, misrepresent important legal and financial information. Conan, Amory's elder brother and lord of St. Aliquis, recognized this vulnerability and ensured that Amory would not fall into such dependence. Amory, along with a few other noble boys, attended classes taught by monks, who patiently guided them through the complexities of medieval literacy. Instruction began with simple Latin phrases and gradually expanded into longer texts and documents. The boys learned to painstakingly inscribe letters onto wax tablets with a stylus, an ancient method of writing that required careful, deliberate movements. The monks, with gentle insistence, emphasized accuracy and clarity, ensuring the young nobles developed a methodical and precise approach to their writing. Amory's favorite lessons involved reading romantic adventures that celebrated legendary heroes. These stories, copied meticulously onto parchment by skilled scribes, provided endless entertainment and moral examples of courage, chivalry, and honor. One favorite topic among medieval nobility was the legendary Trojan War, perceived not merely as an ancient historical conflict but as a grand, baronial feud between noble warriors akin to their own social class. Amory devoured tales detailing the brave exploits of Hector, the great Trojan hero who exemplified bravery and dignity in defeat. These accounts often differed significantly from the ancient narratives known today, emphasizing dramatic battles, heroic duels, and extraordinary feats of strength and courage. Numbers of fallen warriors, exaggerated into hundreds of thousands, filled pages designed not for accuracy, but to awe and impress. The tales of Alexander the Great captivated Amory just as much. In these stories, Alexander's conquests expanded into fantastical territories, including encounters with sirens and mythical beasts. One especially fanciful version even suggested Alexander lamented his inability to conquer France, a detail that particularly delighted young French nobles, affirming their land's perceived preeminence. These romances served multiple purposes. Beyond entertainment, they reinforced social values and moral standards central to medieval aristocratic life. Amory learned about courage, loyalty, generosity, and the consequences of pride and betrayal, absorbing these lessons not through direct lectures but subtly through the actions and outcomes of legendary characters. Chapter 5: Practical Skills and Responsibilities. Let us now shift our attention from literary education to the practical responsibilities and daily tasks assigned to young nobles such as Amory. In the feudal world, the transition from boyhood to adulthood involved mastering a complex range of practical skills essential for maintaining both personal dignity and social responsibilities. Amory's early morning routine exemplified the hands-on nature of his education. Before dawn, he rose from his simple bed in the castle, dressing quietly so as not to disturb others still asleep. His first duty was caring for his lord's horses, particularly the prized war chargers. Amory brushed their coats meticulously, inspected their hooves for any signs of injury or discomfort, and ensured they received proper feed and water. This careful animal husbandry was not merely menial labor. It instilled in Amory a profound sense of duty and attention to detail, qualities essential for future leadership. A nobleman's ability to personally manage valuable animals reflected his competence and pride, enhancing his reputation among peers and subjects alike. Amory also learned to attend closely to his lord's personal needs. He assisted his superior in dressing, carefully managing clothing crafted from expensive materials like silk, velvet, and fine wool. He was expected to anticipate needs and preferences without explicit direction, a subtle skill demonstrating social awareness and sensitivity. At mealtimes, Amory waited upon the lord and lady, presenting dishes with practiced elegance, again signaling his ability to manage delicate social dynamics gracefully. When noble guests visited, Amory prepared their accommodations, ensuring each chamber was clean, comfortable, and suited to their status. He also learned to entertain guests with music, games, and conversation, skills essential for maintaining the castle's reputation as a center of refinement and hospitality. Outside castle walls, Amory undertook responsibilities like escorting noble women safely on journeys and expeditions. These duties required both physical courage and careful diplomacy, balancing protection with respectful courtesy. Amory's ability to navigate these social tasks without causing offense or discomfort was critical for his advancement in noble society. Chapter 6: Martial Training and the Path to Knighthood. We now turn to the rigorous martial training that occupied much of a noble youth's life. For Amory, the culmination of his education was becoming a knight, a goal that dominated his thoughts and actions from childhood. His daily routine at the castle of his mentor, the Count of Bernon, was structured around relentless training in combat techniques. Initially, Amory practiced handling weapons and armor under careful supervision, learning to carry his lord's heavy gear without faltering. Soon, he graduated to wearing his own mail armor, painstakingly crafted to match his growing frame. Training in the tilt yard required endless repetition. Amory practiced couching his lance, maintaining perfect balance while charging, and aiming accurately at targets designed to mimic enemy shields. The quintain, a rotating target dressed in armor, provided a moving challenge, forcing Amory to master both accuracy and timing. These exercises were exhausting, yet vital for mastering skills essential for survival on the battlefield. Real combat practice against other squires offered Amory first-hand experience of the physical shock and emotional intensity of battle. The impact of lances against shields, the powerful recoil through his arm, and the constant threat of falling taught him not only physical skills, but mental resilience. Through countless repetitions, Amory learned that composure and focus were as critical as strength and agility. Chapter 7: Moral and Ethical Education. Beyond martial and practical training, Amory received extensive moral education from his elders. Sessions with Conan were dedicated to instilling a code of noble conduct designed to govern interactions at all social levels. Amory learned foundational lessons about trust, generosity, and humility. He was instructed to be wary of strangers, generous yet prudent with wealth, and respectful yet cautious with inferiors. The moral teachings reinforced social hierarchies clearly. While kindness toward servants was expected, familiarity was strictly discouraged to preserve social distinctions. His education in ethical conduct extended into his personal life. Amory was cautioned against sharing secrets recklessly, particularly within marriage, a viewpoint reflecting medieval perceptions of trust and confidentiality within intimate relationships. Chapter 8: Economic and Social Understanding. Amory's education also included a practical understanding of the economic realities underpinning noble life. Although nobles often appeared indifferent to money, liberally dispensing gifts and largesse, Amory was taught the underlying economics of wealth and generosity. He learned that the constant flow of goods, horses, armor, furs, among nobles reinforced alliances and relationships crucial for social stability. Even the coins thrown casually to peasants carried symbolic meaning, reinforcing the noble's generosity while subtly asserting social dominance. Amory gained insight into the economic origins of noble wealth, derived largely from peasant labor. He understood, with quiet realism, the delicate balance of exploitation and paternalistic generosity that characterized feudal economics. Chapter 9. Achieving Knighthood. Finally, we arrive at the ceremonial culmination of Amory's journey, knighthood. This milestone symbolized his full entrance into the noble class, marking his readiness to assume adult responsibilities. Achieving knighthood required demonstrating mastery of all previous training, martial skill, social grace, moral integrity, and economic awareness. Amory prepared meticulously, awaiting the ceremonial moment when his brother Conan would officially dub him a knight. This ceremony, rich in symbolic gestures, represented not merely personal achievement, but the continuity and stability of noble society itself. With gentle precision, Amory's new identity as a knight was publicly affirmed, securing his place within the complex tapestry of medieval aristocracy. As our gentle exploration ends, allow yourself to drift peacefully, embracing the calm assurance that Amory's extensive education had fully prepared him to take his place among the nobility, preserving the traditions and stability of medieval France. Chapter 10. So you think modern helicopter parenting is intense? Let me tell you about 13th century French noble education, a system so ridiculously comprehensive it makes today's prep schools look like daycare centers. We're talking about an educational approach that could turn a 7-year-old into a battle-ready, politically savvy, Latin-speaking, falcon-training aristocrat by their teens. And honestly, it worked disturbingly well. Picture this. While most peasants couldn't even write their own names, noble kids were getting what was basically the medieval equivalent of an Ivy League education, mixed with military boot camp and finishing school. The whole thing was so expensive that university tuition cost more than what most people earned in an entire year. But here's the thing. It created some of the most capable leaders in European history. Chapter 11. The Cathedral Schools, Medieval Harvard, but with more Jesus. Let's start with where the smart kids went. Cathedral schools. The Cathedral School of Paris wasn't just some random religious institution. It was basically the MIT of medieval Europe, pumped out on the island right next to Notre Dame. Students traveled from across the known world just to sit in these classrooms, which probably smelled like unwashed teenagers and burnt candle wax. The professors were celebrities in their own right. We're talking about guys like Lambert, who was basically the medieval equivalent of a TED Talk superstar. Students would literally walk hundreds of miles just to hear these dudes lecture about theology and philosophy. And when I say lecture, I mean they'd stand there for hours, talking, while students frantically scribbled notes on ridiculously expensive parchment. But here's where it gets interesting. Different regions had completely different educational personalities. Northern French schools were all about dialectics and theology. Basically, they loved arguing about God and logic. Meanwhile, southern schools like Toulouse and Montpellier were more practical, focusing on law and medicine. It's like the medieval version of liberal arts versus STEM majors, except both sides could probably kill you in a duel if you insulted their academic specialty. Then you had the monasteries, which were basically the backup option for noble education. Cluny Abbey alone had over 10,000 monks, scattered across more than 1,100 locations. That's larger than most modern university systems. These weren't just religious retreats. They were massive educational corporations that preserved and transmitted knowledge across Europe. Chapter 12. Daily Life. Wake up at 3 a.m. to pray, then learn Latin. Medieval students didn't mess around with their schedules. Their entire day revolved around the canonical hours, 8 prayer periods that started at 2 a.m. and ended around 9 p.m. Imagine having to wake up at 3 a.m. for mandatory prayer, then immediately transitioning into Latin grammar lessons. No coffee, no energy drinks, just pure medieval determination, and probably a lot of very sleepy teenagers. The seasonal schedule was brutal in its own way. During summer, classes could last from sunrise to sunset. We're talking 12 to 15-hour academic days. In winter, they had to cram everything into maybe 8 hours of daylight, because candles near parchment manuscripts were basically fire hazards waiting to happen. Every piece of written material was so valuable that losing a book to fire was like totaling a Ferrari. University life was equally intense. Students typically started at 13 or 14 years old and stayed for 6 to 12 years. They wore distinctive robes, maintained weird haircuts called tonsures, and followed academic calendars that would make modern college students weep. The University of Paris divided students into 7 groups based on where they came from, which led to exactly the kind of regional rivalries you'd expect from hormonal teenagers with access to swords. Chapter 13. The Curriculum. Memorize everything, question nothing, except in logic class. The medieval curriculum was built around something called the 7 liberal arts, which sounds way more exciting than it actually was. First came the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic. This took 8 to 9 years to complete, during which students basically memorized entire textbooks, written by dead Romans. For grammar, they used Donatus's works, which were essentially the medieval equivalent of those grammar workbooks that make you want to throw things across the room. Then came Priscian's 18-volume grammar reference, because apparently one grammar textbook wasn't nearly enough torture for developing minds. Rhetoric meant studying Cicero, learning how to argue persuasively without actually being allowed to disagree with your teachers. Logic was where things got spicy. Students learned Aristotelian philosophy through translations, which meant they were getting ancient Greek wisdom filtered through Latin translations of Arabic commentaries. It's like playing the world's most academic game of telephone. After surviving the trivium, students moved on to the quadrivium: arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Yes, music was considered mathematics, which explains why medieval songs sound so weird to modern ears. They were literally calculated to be perfect, according to mathematical principles. Advanced students studied theology using Peter Lombard's Sentences, a textbook so influential that commenting on it was basically required for anyone who wanted to be taken seriously as a scholar. This book cited Augustine over 1,000 times, which means medieval students were getting very familiar with some very old religious arguments. Chapter 14. The Teachers, from warrior monks to falcon whisperers. The most important educator in any noble household was the chaplain chancellor, who was basically a medieval combination of priest, secretary, accountant, and teacher. This guy had to know Latin, theology, business correspondence, and how to manage a small army of clerks. He traveled with the Lord, carrying a portable altar, which is possibly the most medieval sentence ever written. But the real educational magic happened with the specialists. Falconers were hereditary positions, literally passed from father to son, because training birds of prey was apparently rocket science in the medieval world. Masters-at-arms taught sword fighting and how not to fall off horses while wearing 60 pounds of metal armor. Music masters taught lute and singing, which was essential for courtly life. because apparently you couldn't be taken seriously as a noble if you couldn't carry a tune. Dancing masters were crucial because medieval dancing was basically social networking with fancy footwork. Get the steps wrong at a feast, and you might accidentally insult a duke or start a diplomatic incident. Foreign language tutors taught French, which was the medieval equivalent of English today. If you wanted to get anywhere in international politics, you had to speak it fluently. Chapter 15. Religion, praying, was literally part of the curriculum. Medieval education wasn't secular at all. Every single day started with morning prayers before any other activities. Students attended daily mass, memorized Bible passages, learned the 10 Commandments, and studied the lives of saints, like they were studying for the world's most important history exam. But it wasn't just memorization. Students learned proper behavior during religious services, church hierarchy, and ecclesiastical etiquette. They had to understand pilgrimage traditions, know which shrines to visit for which purposes, and learn about Christian charity. This wasn't optional spiritual enrichment. This was core curriculum. Students also learned about blessing ceremonies for weapons and armor before battle, religious dedication ceremonies for knights, and how to participate in church councils. The integration of religious and secular authority was so complete that you couldn't understand medieval politics without understanding medieval theology. Chapter 16. Falconry, the most ridiculously complicated hobby ever. Here's where medieval education gets absolutely wild. Falconry training. This wasn't just a fun outdoor activity. It was a sophisticated system that taught patience, observation skills, animal psychology, and social hierarchy, all at once. Different birds corresponded to different social ranks. Eagles for emperors, peregrine falcons for princes, saker falcons for knights, and so on, down the social ladder. Commoners got kestrels, which were basically the Honda Civics of the falcon world. This system reinforced who was important, while teaching incredibly complex animal training techniques. The training methods were insanely detailed. Lure training taught birds to return to a swung target. Creants flying used long leashes to develop hunting skills while maintaining control. Weight management required constant monitoring of the bird's condition to keep them motivated but not starved. Hood training taught birds to accept blindness for transport, which sounds like medieval bird psychology. The equipment alone was mind-boggling. Jesse's leg straps, hoods for transport, bells for tracking, specialized housing called mews, and carrying frames for multiple birds. Learning falconry meant mastering the delicate balance between control and partnership with nature, skills that apparently translated well to military and political leadership. Chapter 17. The price tag, more expensive than your car. Medieval education was absurdly expensive. University tuition cost £2 to £10 per year, when laborers earned only £2 per year total. That's like charging $50,000 to $250,000 for college, when minimum wage workers make $50,000 annually. It was deliberately designed to keep education exclusive to the wealthy elite. Writing materials alone were financial investments. Parchment made from treated animal skins cost nearly as much as hiring someone to hand copy text onto it. By the time paper was introduced from the Islamic world, it cost 1/10 the price of parchment, which made paper manuscripts roughly half the cost of parchment versions. Even the cheap option was still expensive. Professional book production was its own economy. Individual books cost about £5, while collections could cost over £100. Students could rent books by the section to avoid buying complete volumes, but even that was pricey. Professional scribes often got paid so little that one frustrated 13th century copyist wrote in a manuscript, "For so little money, I never want to produce a book ever again." Medieval academic publishing was apparently just as exploitative as modern academic publishing. Chapter 18. Boys versus girls, separate and definitely not equal. Male education focused on governance and military leadership. Boys studied the 7 liberal arts with Latin literacy considered absolutely essential. They learned theology, ethics, economics, and politics. Physical training progressed from page service, ages 7 to 14, in other noble households, through squire training in weaponry and horse management, culminating in knight training, with tournaments and actual combat skills. Female education was completely different and focused on domestic leadership and cultural accomplishments. Girls learned household management, financial oversight, and estate supervision for when their husbands were away, fighting wars or conducting business. They studied reading, often in vernacular languages rather than Latin, poetry, music, and what were basically the medieval arts and crafts. Fosterage arrangements, sending kids to live in other noble households, cost differently by gender. Girls were roughly 1/3 more expensive to foster because of perceived complexity of needs, which is possibly the most medieval way to say, we have no idea what to do with girls. The gender divide was so complete that boys and girls from the same family essentially received totally different educations designed for completely different life paths. Boys were being prepared to rule kingdoms and lead armies. Girls were being prepared to manage estates and navigate court politics. Chapter 19. Real examples. When theory met reality. King Louis IX of France and Queen Margaret of Provence represent the absolute pinnacle of 13th century educational practice. They commissioned the first systematic educational manual for noble children, which became the standard reference across medieval Europe. Their daughter Eleanor personally supervised her son Edward's education and was famous for her love of reading and poetry. The Marshall family shows how fosterage actually worked in practice. William Marshall was sent to live at Château de Tancarville in Normandy at age 12, where he learned biblical stories, Latin prayers, and French Romance literature designed to teach chivalric values. His son continued the tradition, creating lifelong political and military alliances through educational arrangements. These weren't isolated examples. This was the systematic approach that produced the leadership class of medieval Europe. The combination of classical learning, practical skills, religious instruction, and social training created individuals capable of managing incredibly complex feudal societies while advancing European civilization. Chapter 20. Somehow, it actually worked. The most remarkable thing about 13th century French noble education isn't how weird it was, it's how effective it was. This system produced leaders who successfully managed complex feudal societies, advanced European civilization, and created lasting political and cultural institutions. The substantial economic investment, sophisticated teaching methods, and careful attention to both academic and practical training created a governing class that actually knew what they were doing. Sure, it was exclusive, expensive, and completely inaccessible to 99% of the population. But for what it was designed to do, create capable aristocratic leaders, it worked disturbingly well. The integration of theoretical knowledge with practical application, combined with the emphasis on social responsibility and moral development, created leaders who could handle the multifaceted requirements of medieval political life. Modern education could probably learn something from this approach, even if we'd want to make it slightly more democratic and significantly less focused on bird training and sword fighting. The medieval French figured out how to create comprehensive, integrated education that prepared students for real-world leadership responsibilities. They just did it in the most ridiculously complicated and expensive way possible. Chapter 21. The Medieval Mind Games: How Logic Classes Turned into Philosophical Warfare. Here's something that'll blow your mind. Medieval students were basically trained to be professional arguers. The logic portion of their education wasn't just about learning to think clearly. It was about learning to demolish your opponent's arguments so thoroughly that they'd question their own existence. These weren't friendly debates. These were intellectual blood sports. The classroom setup for logic classes was deliberately confrontational. Students sat in a circle while one poor soul stood in the middle, defending a philosophical position against attacks from every direction. Imagine being 15 years old and having to argue why God exists, while a dozen other teenagers try to poke holes in your reasoning using Aristotelian logic. The pressure was so intense that students would sometimes faint from the stress. But here's the twisted part. This actually worked. By the time these kids graduated, they could think on their feet, spot logical fallacies instantly, and construct arguments so airtight that they could convince people of almost anything. These skills translated directly into political and military leadership. When you're negotiating a treaty or commanding troops in battle, the ability to think clearly under pressure becomes literally life or death important. The most advanced students participated in formal disputations, which were basically academic gladiator matches. Two students would be assigned opposing sides of a complex theological or philosophical question, then given weeks to prepare their arguments. The actual disputation could last for hours, with the audience, other students, professors, and sometimes visiting dignitaries acting as judges. Winning one of these disputations was like getting into Harvard and winning an Olympic gold medal simultaneously. Chapter 22. The Art of War: When your homework involved actual combat. Military education for noble boys wasn't just about learning to swing a sword. It was a comprehensive system that combined physical training, strategic thinking, and psychological conditioning. The progression from page to squire to knight wasn't just ceremonial. It was a carefully designed curriculum that took over a decade to complete. Page training started at age 7 and was basically medieval boot camp for children. Boys were sent to live in other noble households, where they learned the absolute basics: how to serve at table without dropping anything, how to care for weapons and armor, how to handle horses without getting kicked in the head, and how to follow orders without question. The physical conditioning was brutal. These kids were essentially doing CrossFit all day, every day. But the psychological training was even more intense. Pages learned to suppress their individual desires in favor of loyalty to their lord. They practiced taking orders from everyone above them in the hierarchy, which in a noble household meant pretty much everyone except other pages. The goal was to break down their natural childhood selfishness and rebuild them as disciplined warriors who could function effectively in a military unit. Squire training, which started around age 14, was where things got serious. Squires were assigned to specific knights and became responsible for maintaining their equipment, caring for their horses, and assisting them in battle. This wasn't just grunt work. Squires had to learn the technical aspects of medieval warfare that could mean the difference between life and death. The equipment maintenance alone required extensive technical knowledge. A full suit of mail contained thousands of individual rings that had to be inspected for damage and rust. Weapons needed constant sharpening and care to prevent them from breaking in combat. War horses required specialized feeding, grooming, and training that was far more complex than caring for ordinary riding horses. Combat training for squires involved wooden weapons at first, then gradually progressed to real steel. They learned not just individual fighting techniques, but formation fighting, siege warfare, and mounted combat. The mounted combat training was particularly challenging because it required perfect coordination between rider and horse, while wearing heavy armor and wielding weapons that could weigh 15 pounds or more. Chapter 23: The Economics of Education. Why knowledge was more valuable than gold. The medieval educational system operated on economic principles that would make modern college administrators weep with envy. Everything was expensive, everyone knew it was expensive, and somehow people still lined up to pay these outrageous prices because the alternative was remaining illiterate and powerless. Book production was essentially a luxury industry. A single illuminated manuscript could cost more than a peasant family's annual income. The materials alone were prohibitively expensive. Parchment, made from specially treated animal skins, inks created from rare minerals and organic compounds, and gold leaf for decorative elements. The labor was even more costly. A skilled scribe could take months to copy a single large book, and illuminators, who added decorative elements, charged premium rates for their artistic skills. The rental system for books was like medieval Netflix, except infinitely more expensive and with significantly more Latin. Students could rent individual sections of books, called pecia, for specific assignments. This allowed them to access texts they couldn't afford to buy, while ensuring that book owners could maximize their investment. The rental fees were calculated based on the length and complexity of the text, with advanced theological works commanding the highest prices. Private tutoring was where the real money was made. Wealthy families would compete to hire the most prestigious scholars as private tutors for their children. These tutors lived in the household, traveled with the family, and provided individualized instruction that was far superior to what students could get in institutional settings. The most sought-after tutors could command salaries equivalent to what skilled craftsmen earned, plus room, board, and other benefits. The regional variations in educational costs reflected local economic conditions and cultural priorities. Northern French schools, closer to major trade routes and political centers, charged premium prices for their proximity to power. Southern schools, while sometimes less expensive, often provided more practical education that could translate directly into lucrative careers in law or medicine. Chapter 24: The Dark Arts, What They Actually Learned About Medicine and Science. Medieval noble education included subjects that modern students would find absolutely fascinating and completely terrifying in equal measure. Medical training for nobles wasn't about becoming professional physicians. It was about understanding enough to keep yourself and your people alive when professional help wasn't available. The medical curriculum combined genuine observation with complete nonsense in ways that somehow occasionally worked. Students learned to identify medicinal plants and prepare basic remedies, which was actually useful knowledge. They also learned about the four humors blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and how to balance them through diet, exercise, and bloodletting, which was less useful and occasionally fatal. Astronomical training was required because medieval people believed that celestial movements directly affected human health and behavior. Students learned to create and interpret astrological charts, calculate the positions of planets, and determine the most auspicious times for various activities. This wasn't considered superstition. It was cutting-edge science based on the best understanding of the universe available at the time. The alchemical training was where things got really weird. Students learned about the properties of various metals and chemicals, often through hands-on experimentation, that would make modern safety inspectors have nervous breakdowns. They studied the theoretical foundations of transmutation, turning base metals into gold, while also learning practical applications like creating pigments for manuscripts and medicines for common ailments. Natural philosophy, which was basically early physics and biology, involved studying the works of Aristotle and other ancient authorities while making direct observations of the natural world. Students learned about the mechanics of simple machines, the properties of different materials, and the behavior of animals. This combination of theoretical knowledge and practical observation laid the groundwork for later scientific developments. Chapter 25. Court Life. The ultimate social media training. Learning to navigate court society was arguably the most important part of noble education because it determined whether you'd succeed or fail in the political arena. Court etiquette wasn't just about knowing which fork to use. It was a complex system of social signaling that could make or break careers. The clothing regulations alone were mind-bogglingly complex. Different colors, fabrics, and styles indicated specific social ranks and political affiliations. Wearing the wrong thing to the wrong event could be interpreted as an insult, a political statement, or evidence of social climbing. Students had to memorize not just what to wear, but when to wear it, how to wear it, and what it communicated to everyone around them. Dancing wasn't recreational, it was political networking with choreography. Different dances were appropriate for different social situations, and partnering choices sent clear messages about alliances, romantic interests, and political loyalties. A well-executed dance could cement a business relationship or diplomatic alliance. A poorly executed dance could start a feud that lasted for generations. Conversation skills required understanding multiple languages, literary references, current political situations, and historical precedents. Court conversation was essentially a competitive sport where participants tried to demonstrate their intelligence, education, and social awareness while gathering information about everyone else's plans and loyalties. The ability to say exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment could open doors that remained closed to less socially skilled nobles. Gift-giving protocols were incredibly complex and carried enormous political significance. The value, timing, and nature of gifts sent specific messages about relationships and intentions. Students had to learn what to give, when to give it, how to present it, and how to interpret the gifts they received. A poorly chosen gift could destroy a diplomatic relationship, while a perfectly chosen gift could create powerful alliances. Chapter 26. The International Network. How Medieval Education Created Global Connections. One of the most remarkable aspects of medieval noble education was how it created an international network of educated elites who shared common languages, cultural references, and intellectual frameworks. This wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate strategy that helped maintain political stability across medieval Europe. Latin served as the universal academic language, which meant that educated nobles from England, France, Germany, and Italy could communicate directly with each other without interpreters. This created a shared intellectual culture that transcended national boundaries and made diplomatic negotiations significantly easier. When you could quote the same classical authors and understand the same theological arguments, you had a foundation for communication that went far beyond basic diplomacy. The exchange student system was already well developed by the 13th century. Noble families routinely sent their children to study in other countries, both to acquire specific skills and to build international relationships. These educational exchanges created personal bonds that often influenced political decisions for decades. A king who had studied alongside the son of another ruler was far less likely to go to war against that ruler and far more likely to seek diplomatic solutions to conflicts. University networks facilitated the exchange of ideas and innovations across Europe. Scholars moved freely between institutions, carrying new knowledge and teaching methods with them. This academic mobility meant that educational innovations developed in one region quickly spread to others, creating a surprisingly standardized educational system across very different political entities. The pilgrimage system provided additional opportunities for international education and networking. Noble families often combined religious pilgrimages with educational tours, visiting universities, courts, and cultural centers along their routes. These pilgrimages created opportunities for young nobles to see different political systems, experience different cultures, and build relationships with their international peers. Chapter 27: Assessment and Evaluation. Medieval Grading on a Curve. Medieval educational assessment was far more complex and nuanced than modern standardized testing, though it was arguably just as stressful for students. Rather than relying on written examinations, medieval educators used a combination of oral examinations, practical demonstrations, and peer evaluation to assess student progress. Oral examinations were public events that could make or break academic careers. Students had to demonstrate their knowledge in front of panels of professors and often visiting scholars or nobles. These examinations tested not just factual knowledge, but the ability to think quickly, argue persuasively, and maintain composure under pressure. The public nature of these examinations meant that failure was not just academically damaging, it was socially humiliating. Practical demonstrations were used to assess skills that couldn't be evaluated through oral examination. Military training included formal tournaments, where students demonstrated their combat skills in front of audiences that included potential employers and marriage prospects. Falconry training culminated in hunting expeditions, where students had to demonstrate their ability to work effectively with their birds in real-world conditions. Peer evaluation played a significant role in medieval education because students were expected to learn from each other as well as from their teachers. Senior students were responsible for teaching and evaluating junior students, which meant that social skills and leadership abilities were constantly being assessed by one's peers. This system created strong incentives for cooperation and mentorship, while also identifying natural leaders. The progression from one educational level to the next wasn't automatic. It required formal recognition from teachers and often approval from parents or guardians. Students who failed to meet expectations could be held back, transferred to different programs, or removed from educational opportunities entirely. This created intense pressure to succeed, but also ensured that those who did complete their education had demonstrated real competence. Chapter 28: The Failures and Dropouts. What happened when medieval education didn't work? Not everyone succeeded in the medieval educational system, and the consequences of failure were often severe and long-lasting. Understanding what happened to educational failures provides insight into both the pressures of the system and the limited options available to young nobles who couldn't meet expectations. Academic failures in university settings faced social disgrace that could affect their family's reputation for generations. Students who couldn't master Latin, failed their oral examinations, or were caught cheating faced expulsion, not just from their current institution, but from the entire university system. In a society where education was the primary path to political and social advancement, academic failure often meant permanent exclusion from positions of authority. Military training failures faced different but equally serious consequences. Boys who couldn't master the physical demands of combat training, or who showed cowardice in practice situations, were often redirected into religious careers, whether they had religious vocations or not. This wasn't necessarily a punishment. The church offered legitimate paths to power and influence, but it represented a significant limitation of life choices based on physical and psychological capabilities. Social failures in court education could be even more devastating because they affected not just the individual student, but their entire family's political prospects. Young nobles who consistently made social blunders, failed to understand court etiquette, or demonstrated poor judgment in their personal relationships could damage their family's standing and reduce their siblings' marriage prospects and career opportunities. The gender differences in educational failure had particularly harsh consequences for young women. Girls who failed to master household management skills or who demonstrated inappropriate behavior faced severely limited marriage prospects, which in turn affected their family's ability to form political alliances through strategic marriages. The options for unmarried noble women were extremely limited, essentially restricted to religious life or dependence on male relatives. Chapter 29: Legacy and Long-Term Impact. How Medieval Education Shaped European Civilization. The educational system of 13th century French nobility created lasting changes that influenced European civilization for centuries. The institutional structures, teaching methods, and cultural values developed during this period provided the foundation for later educational developments and political innovations. The university system that emerged from cathedral schools became the model for higher education throughout Europe and eventually the Americas. The basic structure of faculties, degrees, and academic ranks developed during this period remained largely unchanged until the modern era. The emphasis on combining theoretical knowledge with practical application became a defining characteristic of Western education. The integration of religious and secular education created a governing class that understood both temporal and spiritual authority, which proved crucial for managing the complex relationship between church and state that defined medieval politics. This educational approach produced leaders who could navigate religious controversies, manage ecclesiastical properties, and understand the theological implications of political decisions. The international character of medieval education contributed to the development of shared European cultural and political values that facilitated diplomacy and reduced conflicts. The common educational background of European nobles created a foundation for communication and negotiation that helped prevent many potential wars and facilitated peaceful resolution of disputes. The emphasis on practical skills combined with theoretical knowledge produced remarkably capable administrators who created efficient governmental systems, managed complex economic relationships, and maintained political stability across large territories. The administrative innovations developed by medieval nobles educated in this system provided the foundation for later governmental developments. The preservation and transmission of classical knowledge through the medieval educational system ensured that ancient wisdom remained available for later Renaissance scholars, who used it as the foundation for renewed cultural and intellectual development. Without the careful preservation work done by medieval educators, much of our classical heritage would have been permanently lost. This educational system, despite its limitations and exclusions, created one of history's most effective approaches to developing capable leadership. The combination of intellectual rigor, practical training, moral development, and social preparation produced individuals who could handle the enormous complexities of medieval political life while advancing European civilization. The model they created continues to influence educational thinking and practice even today, demonstrating the enduring value of comprehensive, integrated approaches to learning and development.